June 1942. The Libyan desert stretched endlessly beneath a sky bleached white by heat. Sand dunes rolled like frozen waves, shimmering in temperatures that could melt the rubber off a tire. Somewhere deep in the wasteland, 200 miles behind enemy lines, 2 British jeeps sat motionless beneath camouflage nets. Their engines ticked as they cooled. Their crews, faces wrapped in sand-stained scarves, watched through binoculars as a German supply convoy snaked its way along a dirt track below. 40 trucks, maybe more, fuel tankers, ammunition lorries, water carriers, all heading toward Rommel's Afrika Korps, the legendary Desert Fox, who had pushed the British back across North Africa for months. The convoy was guarded by armored cars, motorcycle outriders, and somewhere in the middle, a Panzer III tank, its turret rotating slowly, scanning the horizon. The odds were impossible. 2 jeeps against an entire convoy, 8 men against hundreds. No air support, no backup, no radio contact with headquarters. Just improvised machine gun mounts, a few hundred rounds of ammunition, and a plan so audacious it bordered on insanity. Captain David Stirling, founder of the Special Air Service, had called it strategic raiding. His men called it something else: suicide with style. Inside the lead jeep, Sergeant Jack Riley from Manchester checked his watch. The sun would set in 2 hours. That's when they'd strike. Not with overwhelming force, but with speed, surprise, and sheer nerve. Because in the Desert War of 1942, the British had learned something the Germans hadn't yet understood. You didn't need to win every battle. You just needed to make the enemy afraid to sleep. Riley looked at his gunner, a 19-year-old kid from Glasgow named Tommy Fraser, who was nervously adjusting the twin Vickers K machine guns mounted on the Jeep's hood. "You ready for this?" Riley asked. Fraser swallowed hard. "No, Sarge. But I don't think that matters anymore." Riley smiled grimly. "Good answer." And as the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, 2 jeeps prepared to do the impossible. Not because they were invincible, but because someone had to. And in the vast, merciless expanse of the North African desert, the SAS had become the ghosts that haunted Rommel's dreams. The birth of the SAS. Before the jeeps, before the raids, before the legend, there was just one man with an idea that everyone thought was mad. David Stirling was 25 years old in 1941, a lieutenant in the Scots Guards who had been transferred to a commando unit in the Middle East. He was tall, over 6 feet, with a quiet intensity that made people listen when he spoke. But what set him apart wasn't his size or his rank. It was his refusal to accept that the war in North Africa was unwinnable. By mid-1941, the British were losing badly. Rommel's Afrika Korps had arrived in Libya and turned the tide completely. German tanks, better-trained crews, superior tactics. The British were being pushed back toward Egypt, losing ground every week. Morale was collapsing. Supplies were stretched thin, and worst of all, the enemy seemed untouchable. Rommel's supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across the desert, from Tripoli to the front lines. Convoys moved at night, protected by air cover during the day. British bombers tried to hit them, but were often shot down or missed their targets entirely. The Germans felt safe, confident, untouchable. Stirling saw it differently. He believed that small teams of highly trained soldiers operating deep behind enemy lines could do what bombers couldn't. They could strike supply depots, airfields, fuel dumps, not with overwhelming force, but with precision. Hit fast, disappear, repeat. The problem? No one believed him. The British military in 1941 was rigid, hierarchical, obsessed with protocol. Stirling's idea, small independent units operating without direct command, was seen as reckless, unorthodox, and frankly, a waste of resources. So Stirling did something extraordinary. He bypassed the entire chain of command. In July 1941, while recovering from a parachute training accident that left him on crutches, he hobbled into Middle East headquarters in Cairo, slipped past the guards, and walked straight into the office of General Neil Ritchie, the Deputy Chief of Staff. He handed Ritchie a handwritten memo outlining his plan. Small teams, night raids, strategic targets, maximum disruption with minimal resources. Ritchie read it. Then he looked up at Stirling, this injured lieutenant who had just broken about a dozen regulations to get into his office, and said, "This is either brilliant or completely insane." Stirling replied, "Probably both, sir." 3 weeks later, Stirling was given permission to form a new unit, 66 men, volunteers only. They would be called L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name was deliberately misleading, designed to make the Germans think the British had a parachute brigade in the region. In reality, it was just Stirling and a handful of men who were willing to try something no one else would. They trained in the desert, learned to navigate by stars, practiced demolitions, weapons handling, survival. They were taught to move silently, strike without warning, and vanish before the enemy could respond. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were raiders, ghosts. And in November 1941, they launched their first operation. It was a disaster. Dropped by parachute in a sandstorm, most of the men were scattered, injured, or captured. Only 22 of the original 55 returned. Stirling's idea seemed doomed, but he didn't quit. Instead, he changed tactics. No more parachutes. They would use vehicles. Fast, mobile, armed to the teeth. They would drive deep into the desert, strike at night, and disappear before dawn. And that's when everything changed. Because in the vast, empty expanse of the Libyan desert, speed and surprise were more valuable than armor. And the SAS was about to prove it. The Long-Range Desert Group. Stirling's plan required one thing he didn't have: a way to get his men hundreds of miles behind enemy lines without being detected. That's where the Long-Range Desert Group came in. The LRDG had been formed in 1940 by Major Ralph Bagnold, a British officer and explorer who had spent years mapping the Libyan desert before the war. Bagnold understood something most military commanders didn't. The desert wasn't an obstacle. It was a highway. If you knew how to navigate it, if you had the right vehicles and the right training, you could move across it faster and more secretly than any road or railway. The LRDG used modified trucks, Chevrolets mostly, stripped down, reinforced, equipped with extra fuel tanks, water supplies, and navigation equipment. They could travel for weeks without resupply, moving through terrain the Germans thought was impassable. Their job was reconnaissance, watching enemy movements, reporting back, staying invisible. But when Stirling approached them with his plan, they saw an opportunity. The LRDG could get the SAS to their targets, drop them off, wait in the desert, then pick them up after the raid. It was a perfect partnership. The LRDG provided the transport and navigation. The SAS provided the firepower and audacity. The first joint operation took place in December 1941. The target was a German airfield at Sirte on the Libyan coast. The LRDG drove Stirling and his men 300 miles across the desert, dropped them off at night, and waited. The SAS crept onto the airfield, planted bombs on 24 German aircraft, and vanished. By the time the bombs exploded, they were miles away. It worked. Perfectly. The Germans were stunned. How had the British gotten so deep behind their lines? How had they known where the airfield was? And most importantly, how had they escaped? Over the next few months, the SAS and LRDG repeated the operation again and again. Airfields, supply dumps, fuel depots. Each raid was meticulously planned, executed with precision, and followed by a rapid withdrawal into the desert. The Germans began to panic. Rommel himself issued orders to increase security, but it didn't help. The desert was too vast, the SAS too fast. But there was a problem. The LRDG trucks, while reliable, were slow. And the SAS needed speed. They needed vehicles that could strike fast, maneuver in combat, and carry enough firepower to fight their way out if things went wrong. That's when they discovered the Jeep. The American Willys Jeep. Small, light, fast, and incredibly tough. The British had received hundreds of them through Lend-Lease, and the SAS immediately saw their potential. They stripped them down even further, removing windshields, doors, anything that added weight. Then they mounted machine guns. Lots of them. The standard configuration was twin Vickers K machine guns on the hood, a single Vickers in the rear, and sometimes a Browning 50 caliber for good measure. Each Jeep carried over 2,000 rounds of ammunition, enough for sustained fire. They also carried water, fuel, explosives, and survival gear. They were mobile weapons platforms designed for one purpose: hit hard, move fast, disappear. And they painted them pink. Not bright pink, but a dusty, faded rose color that blended perfectly with the desert at dawn and dusk. The Germans called them Pink Panthers. The SAS called them the best weapon they'd ever had. By mid-1942, the SAS had perfected their tactics. Small teams, 2 or 3 Jeeps, would drive hundreds of miles into enemy territory, strike at night, and vanish before the Germans could respond. They didn't fight fair. They didn't follow rules. They just won. And Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, was starting to realize he had a problem. Because no matter how many guards he posted, no matter how many patrols he sent out, the British kept coming. And they were getting bolder. The men who drove them. The SAS didn't recruit soldiers. They recruited individuals, men who could think for themselves, adapt to chaos, and operate without orders. The selection process was brutal. Candidates were pushed to their physical and mental limits. Most failed. Those who passed became part of something unique, a brotherhood built on trust, skill, and a shared willingness to do what others wouldn't. Sergeant Jack Riley was one of them. Born in Manchester in 1918, he'd grown up in the slums, the son of a factory worker who drank too much, and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep the family fed. Jack learned early that life wasn't fair, but you could survive it if you were smart, tough, and willing to take risks. He joined the Army in 1936, not out of patriotism, but because it was better than the factory. He was good at it. Disciplined, calm under pressure, and most importantly, he could lead. By 1940, he was a sergeant in the Royal Engineers, serving in North Africa. When Stirling put out the call for volunteers for a new unit, Riley was one of the first to sign up. He didn't do it for glory. He did it because he was bored. The regular army was too slow, too predictable. The SAS offered something different: freedom, responsibility, the chance to make a real difference. His gunner, Tommy Fraser, was the opposite: young, nervous, eager to prove himself. He'd lied about his age to enlist, claiming he was 18 when he was really 16. By the time anyone figured it out, he was already in North Africa. He was assigned to Riley's jeep not because he was the best shot, but because Riley saw something in him. Potential. The kind of raw courage that, if properly channeled, could turn a scared kid into a deadly operator. The other jeep was commanded by Corporal Mike Sadler, a navigator from the LRDG who had transferred to the SAS. Sadler was a genius with maps and stars. He could navigate across hundreds of miles of featureless desert using nothing but a compass, a sextant, and his own instincts. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. His gunner was a South African named Piet van der Merwe, a former farmer who could strip and reassemble a Vickers K blindfolded. These four men, Riley, Fraser, Sadler, and van der Merwe, were about to undertake one of the most audacious raids of the entire North African campaign. Not because they were ordered to, but because they saw an opportunity. And in the SAS, opportunity was everything. The target. Intelligence had been tracking a German supply convoy for 3 days. It was a big one, over 40 vehicles, moving from Tripoli towards the front lines near El Alamein. The convoy carried fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and most importantly, water. In the desert, water was more valuable than gold. Without it, tanks couldn't operate, men couldn't fight, and entire divisions ground to a halt. The convoy was heavily guarded. Armored cars at the front and rear, motorcycle outriders, and in the middle, a Panzer III tank. The Panzer was there for one reason: to deter exactly the kind of raid the SAS was planning. The Germans had learned from previous attacks. They knew the British were operating behind their lines. They knew about the jeeps, the night raids, the hit-and-run tactics. So they adapted. More guards, better spacing, heavier weapons, and tanks. Because tanks, they believed, were invincible against jeeps. They were wrong, but they didn't know it yet. The convoy was scheduled to pass through a narrow valley about 180 miles south of Benghazi. The valley was flanked by low ridges, perfect for an ambush. But the timing had to be perfect. Strike too early, and the convoy would scatter. Too late, and they'd be trapped in daylight. The SAS had a window of about 20 minutes. After that, they'd be dead. Riley and Sadler studied the maps for hours. They calculated distances, fuel consumption, escape routes. They identified 3 possible ambush points, then narrowed it to 1. A spot where the valleys narrowed, forcing the convoy into a tight column. That's where they'd hit. The plan was simple. Wait until the convoy entered the valley. Let the lead vehicles pass. Then strike the middle, targeting the fuel tankers and ammunition trucks. Create chaos. The Panzer would respond, but by then, the SAS would already be moving. They'd fire, maneuver, fire again. Keep the Germans off balance. Then, when the moment was right, they'd vanish into the desert. It was a plan that required perfect timing, perfect execution, and a lot of luck. But the SAS didn't believe in luck. They believed in preparation. And they'd been preparing for this moment for months. On the afternoon of June 14, 1942, Riley and his team loaded their jeeps and headed into the desert. They drove for 12 hours, navigating by stars, moving slowly to avoid detection. By dawn, they were in position, hidden beneath camouflage nets on a ridge overlooking the valley. And then they waited. Waiting was the hardest part. The heat was unbearable. The sun turned the jeeps into ovens. Flies swarmed. Water was rationed. Every hour felt like 10. But they didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. At 4 in the afternoon, they heard it, the distant rumble of engines. The convoy was coming. Riley raised his binoculars. There. Dust clouds on the horizon. He counted vehicles. 42. More than expected. He scanned for the Panzer. Found it. Middle of the column, exactly where intelligence said it would be. He looked at Fraser. The kid was pale, sweating. "You good?" Riley asked. Fraser nodded. "Yeah, Sarge. I'm good." Riley didn't believe him. But it didn't matter. In 2 hours, they'd either be heroes or corpses. And in the SS, those were often the same thing. The ambush. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley floor. The German convoy moved slowly, cautiously. The lead vehicles, 2 armored cars, scanned the ridges with binoculars. Behind them came the trucks, spaced evenly, engines growling. In the middle, the Panzer III, its turret rotating slowly, watching for threats. Riley watched through his binoculars, counting vehicles as they passed. 1, 5, 10. He waited. The key was patience. Let the lead vehicles pass. Let the convoy stretch out. Then strike the middle, where the fuel and ammunition were concentrated. 15 vehicles had passed. The Panzer was entering the kill zone. Riley's hand hovered over the ignition. Not yet. Wait. 20 vehicles. The fuel tankers were in position. Now! Go, Riley said quietly. Both jeeps roared to life. They burst from cover, engines screaming, tires kicking up sand. They raced down the ridge, closing the distance in seconds. The Germans didn't see them at first. By the time they did, it was too late. Fraser opened fire. The twin Vickers K machine guns erupted, spitting 1,200 rounds per minute. Tracer rounds streaked across the valley like angry fireflies. The first burst hit a fuel tanker. The explosion was instant and catastrophic. A fireball erupted, sending a shockwave across the convoy. The truck behind it swerved, crashed into a ditch, and flipped. Sadler's jeep came in from the opposite side, Van der Merwe firing in controlled bursts. He targeted an ammunition truck. The rounds punched through the canvas cover, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the truck exploded. Not a fireball, but a series of rapid detonations, like a string of firecrackers. Ammunition cooked off, sending shrapnel in every direction. German soldiers dove for cover. The convoy erupted into chaos. Trucks stopped, collided, tried to reverse. Soldiers jumped out, scrambling for weapons. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear over the explosions and gunfire. And in the middle of it all, the Panzer III rotated its turret, searching for targets. Riley saw it. "Panzer, 2 o'clock, move!" The jeeps split, racing in opposite directions. The Panzer fired. The shells screamed past Riley's jeep, missing by inches, and exploded against the ridge behind them. The blast sent rocks and sand raining down. "Keep moving!" Riley shouted. "Don't stop!" The jeeps circled the convoy like wolves around a wounded animal. Fraser kept firing, short bursts, conserving ammunition. Every burst hit something. Trucks, soldiers, equipment. The Germans tried to return fire, but they couldn't track the jeeps. Too fast. Too unpredictable. The Panzer fired again, this time at Sadler's jeep. The shell hit the ground just behind them, the explosion lifting the rear wheels off the ground. The jeep landed hard, but Sadler kept driving, swerving, accelerating. "We can't keep this up," Van der Merwe shouted. "That tank's going to get us." Sadler didn't answer. He was focused, calculating. The Panzer was slow, its turret traverse even slower. If they kept moving, kept changing direction, it couldn't hit them. But they couldn't run forever. They needed to end this. Riley had the same thought. He keyed his radio. "Sadler, on me. We're going for the Panzer." "Are you insane?" Sadler replied. "Probably. Just follow my lead." Riley swung his jeep around, heading straight for the Panzer. Fraser's eyes went wide. "Sarge, what are you doing?" "Giving him a target he can't resist." The Panzer's turret rotated, tracking Riley's jeep. The barrel lowered. Riley could see the gunner inside, lining up the shot. He waited. Closer. Closer. Then, at the last second, he swerved hard left. The Panzer fired. The shell missed, exploding harmlessly in the sand. And in that moment, while the Panzer's crew was reloading, Sadler's jeep came in from the side. Van der Merwe aimed for the vision slits, the weak points in the armor. He fired. Tracer rounds sparked off the hull, then found the slits. The rounds punched through, ricocheting inside the tank. The Panzer stopped. Smoke poured from the hatches. The crew bailed out, stumbling, coughing. One of them was on fire. He rolled in the sand, screaming. "Go, go, go!" Riley shouted. Both jeeps accelerated, racing out of the valley. Behind them, the convoy was a burning wreck. Trucks ablaze, ammunition still cooking off. Soldiers scattered and disorganized. The ambush had lasted less than 10 minutes. But in those 10 minutes, the SAS had destroyed over a dozen vehicles, killed or wounded dozens of soldiers, and crippled a supply convoy that Rommel desperately needed. As they disappeared into the desert, Fraser looked back at the smoke rising into the sky. "Did we just do that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Riley smiled. "Yeah, kid, we did." But they weren't safe yet. Not even close, because the Germans were coming, and they were angry. The chase. The first rule of SAS raiding was simple. Hit fast, disappear faster. The second rule was even simpler. Never stop moving. Riley and Sadler drove hard, pushing the jeeps to their limits. The engine screamed, the suspension rattled over rocks and dunes, and the heat from the exhausts mixed with the desert air to create a shimmering haze. Behind them, the smoke from the burning convoy rose like a black pillar, visible for miles. They had maybe 20 minutes before the Germans organized a pursuit. Maybe less. Riley checked his compass, adjusted their heading. They were driving southeast, away from the coast, deeper into the desert. The plan was to put as much distance as possible between them and the convoy, then circle back north toward British lines. But plans rarely survived contact with the enemy, and the Germans were faster than expected. Fraser, manning the rear gun, spotted them first. "Vehicles! 3 o'clock!" Riley glanced over his shoulder. Dust clouds. Multiple vehicles. Moving fast. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. Armored cars, I think." Riley cursed. Armored cars were bad news. Faster than tanks, better armed than trucks, and crewed by men who knew the desert as well as the SAS did. This wasn't going to be a clean escape. He keyed the radio. "Sadler, we've got company. 4 armored cars, closing fast." "I see them," Sadler replied. "What's the play?" Riley thought fast. They couldn't outrun armored cars. Not in a straight line. But they didn't need to. The desert wasn't flat. It was full of wadis, dry riverbeds that cut through the landscape like scars. If they could reach one, they could use the terrain to their advantage. "Head for that wadi, 2 miles southeast. We'll lose them in the rocks." "Copy." The jeeps changed course, angling toward a dark line on the horizon. The wadi. Behind them, the armored cars adjusted, closing the gap. They were less than a mile away now, close enough that Riley could see the German markings on the hulls. "They're gaining!" Fraser shouted. "I know, just keep your head down." The first shots rang out. Machine gun fire, kicking up sand around the jeeps. The Germans were firing on the move, not accurate, but close enough to be terrifying. Fraser returned fire, short bursts, trying to keep them at bay. One of the armored cars pulled ahead of the others, its commander standing in the hatch, directing fire. Van der Merwe targeted him. A burst from the Vickers. The commander jerked, slumped, and disappeared inside the vehicle. The armored car swerved, slowed, but didn't stop. The wadi was close now. Riley could see the edge, a sharp drop into a rocky channel. He didn't slow down. "Hold on!" The jeep hit the edge and went airborne. For a moment, they were flying, suspended in mid-air, the engine roaring, the wheels spinning. Then they crashed down, the suspension bottoming out, the impact jarring every bone in Riley's body. But they were in. The wadi. Sadler's jeep followed, landing hard, skidding sideways before Sadler regained control. They raced down the wadi, weaving between rocks, the walls rising on either side. The armored cars reached the edge, hesitated. The drop was steep, maybe 10 feet. Too much for their heavier vehicles. But the Germans didn't give up. They split up, 2 cars heading east, 2 west, looking for a way down. Riley knew they'd find one. The wadi wasn't continuous. There were breaks, places where the walls collapsed, where vehicles could enter. "We need to slow them down," Riley said. "Sadler, you keep moving. I'll set a surprise." "What kind of surprise?" Riley reached into the back of the jeep, pulled out a canvas bag. Inside were blocks of plastic explosive, detonators, and wire. "The kind that goes boom." He stopped the jeep, jumped out. Fraser looked at him like he was insane. "Sarge, they're right behind us." "Then I better work fast." Riley ran to a narrow section of the wadi where the walls pinched together. He placed 2 blocks of explosive on either side, wedged them into cracks in the rock, then ran wire back to a detonator. It was crude, but it would work. He hoped. He jumped back in the jeep. "Go." They raced down the wadi, putting distance between them and the explosives. Behind them, the first armored car appeared, entering the wadi from a collapsed section. It accelerated, closing the gap. Riley watched through the rear mirror. Closer. Closer. The armored car entered the narrow section. Riley pressed the detonator. The explosion was massive. The walls of the wadi collapsed, tons of rock and sand cascading down, burying the armored car. The vehicle disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. When the dust cleared, there was nothing but a pile of rubble. "One down," Riley muttered. But there were still 3 more, and they were getting smarter. Instead of following into the wadi, they were paralleling it, staying on the high ground, waiting for the SAS to emerge. Riley and Sadler drove for another 30 minutes, the sun sinking lower, the shadows growing longer. They were running out of daylight, and fuel, and options. Finally, they reached the end of the wadi. It opened onto a flat plain, no cover, nowhere to hide. And waiting on the plain, spread out in a line, were the 3 remaining armored cars. "Well," Sadler said over the radio, "this is going to be interesting." Riley stared at the armored cars. They had 2 choices, fight or surrender. And the SAS didn't surrender. "Load everything," Riley said. "We're going through them." Fraser looked at him. "You're serious." "Dead serious. We hit them fast, break through the line, and keep going. They won't expect it." "That's because it's insane." Riley grinned. "Exactly." He revved the engine. Sadler did the same. And together, 2 jeeps charged across the open plain toward 3 armored cars, guns blazing, engines screaming, and the sun setting behind them like the end of the world. Breaking through. The distance between the jeeps and the armored cars closed in seconds. Riley's foot was flat on the accelerator, the engine howling, the speedometer needle buried. Fraser gripped the twin Vickers, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched. The armored cars opened fire, machine guns chattering, rounds kicking up sand in front of the jeeps. "Straight through!" Riley shouted. "Don't stop!" Fraser squeezed the triggers. The Vickers erupted, tracer rounds streaking toward the center armored car. The rounds sparked off the armor, doing no damage, but forcing the crew to duck. That was enough. The armored car's fire slackened, just for a moment. Sadler's jeep veered left, targeting the armored car on that flank. Vandermerwe fired in long, sustained bursts, aiming for the tires. One burst hit. The tire exploded, and the armored car lurched, slowed, its driver fighting for control. Riley aimed for the gap between the center and right armored cars. It was narrow, maybe 30 feet, but it was there. He didn't slow down. The jeep shot through the gap, so close Riley could see the faces of the German gunners, their eyes wide with surprise. They were through. Behind them, the armored cars tried to turn, to pursue, but they were too slow. By the time they completed their turns, the jeeps were already 200 yards away, racing into the gathering darkness. Riley didn't slow down. Not for another hour. Not until the sun had set completely, and the desert was dark, and the only light came from the stars overhead. Finally he stopped. Sadler pulled up beside him. They sat in silence for a moment, engines ticking as they cooled, the night air cold after the heat of the day. Fraser was shaking, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Vandermerwe lit a cigarette, his hand steady. "That," Sadler said finally, "was the stupidest thing I've ever done." Riley laughed. "Yeah, but it worked." They checked their vehicles. Bullet holes in the bodywork, one tire shredded, fuel low, but nothing critical. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd made it. But they weren't home yet. They were still 150 miles behind enemy lines, low on fuel, and the Germans would be looking for them. They needed to move, to put more distance between them and the pursuit. But first, they needed to rest, just for a few hours. They found a small depression, hidden from view, and pulled the jeeps in. They didn't light a fire, didn't make noise, just ate cold rations, drank warm water, and tried to sleep. Riley took first watch, sitting on the hood of his jeep, scanning the horizon with binoculars. Fraser climbed up beside him. "Sarge, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why do you do this? The raids, the risks. You could have stayed in the regular army, safer, easier." Riley was quiet for a moment. "You ever feel like you're meant to do something? Like there's a reason you're here, in this place, at this time?" Fraser nodded. "Yeah, I think so." "That's why. Because if we don't do this, who will? The Germans think they're untouchable. They think they can do whatever they want, and no one can stop them. But they're wrong. We can stop them. Not by fighting fair, but by being smarter, faster, braver. By making them afraid." Fraser looked out at the desert. "Do you think it's working? Do you think we're making a difference?" Riley smiled. "Kid, we just destroyed a convoy, disabled a Panzer, and escaped from 3 armored cars. Yeah, I think we're making a difference." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars. Then Fraser said, "Thanks, Sarge, for letting me be part of this." Riley clapped him on the shoulder. "You earned it, kid. Now get some sleep. We've got a long drive tomorrow." Fraser climbed down, curled up in the back of the jeep, and within minutes was asleep. Riley stayed on watch, his eyes scanning the darkness, his mind already planning the next move. Because in the SAS there was always a next move, Always another target, always another raid. And somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the North African desert, Rommel was starting to realize that his supply lines weren't safe anymore, that the British had found a way to strike back, and that the ghosts in the pink jeeps were just getting started. Rommel's nightmare. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was not a man easily rattled. He had earned his reputation as the Desert Fox through brilliance, audacity, and an almost supernatural ability to outthink his opponents. But by the summer of 1942, something was changing. His supply convoys were being attacked with increasing frequency. Airfields were being sabotaged. Fuel dumps were exploding, and no one could figure out how. At first, Rommel assumed it was air raids, but the attacks were too precise, too targeted. Bombers couldn't operate at night with that kind of accuracy. Then he thought it might be local resistance, Arab tribesmen sympathetic to the British. But the attacks were too sophisticated, too well coordinated. It wasn't until a captured British soldier, wounded and delirious, mentioned the jeeps that Rommel began to understand. Small teams, operating deep behind German lines, striking at night, vanishing before dawn. It was a new kind of warfare, and Rommel didn't like it. He issued orders, increase patrols, double the guards on convoys, send out reconnaissance planes. But it didn't help. The SAS were too fast, too unpredictable. They struck where they were least expected, then disappeared into the desert like ghosts. Rommel's staff began to call them the Phantom Raiders. His soldiers called them something else, the Devils in Pink Jeeps. Because by now the distinctive color of the SAS vehicles had become legendary. German soldiers swapped stories around campfires, tales of jeeps appearing out of nowhere, guns blazing, then vanishing before anyone could react. Some of the stories were exaggerated, some were true. All of them were terrifying. The psychological impact was enormous. German soldiers became nervous, jumpy. Convoy drivers refused to travel at night. Guards fired at shadows. Morale began to crack. Because the one thing soldiers fear more than a visible enemy is an invisible one. And the SAS had become invisible. Rommel knew he had to do something. He couldn't afford to lose more supplies. His offensive toward Egypt was already stalling due to fuel shortages. If the British kept hitting his convoys, he'd have to retreat. And retreat was not an option. He called a meeting with his senior officers. "I want these raiders found," he said. "I want them captured or killed. I don't care how. Just stop them." His intelligence officer, a meticulous man named Colonel Westphal, spread a map on the table. "The problem, Herr Feldmarschall, is that we don't know where they're operating from. They could be anywhere in the desert, hundreds of square miles of nothing." "Then search every mile," Rommel snapped. "Send out patrols. Use aircraft. Offer rewards for information. I want results." But results were hard to come by. The SAS were masters of evasion. They moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a night. They used the desert like a shield, hiding in wadis, behind dunes, in places no one would think to look. And when the Germans did find them, the SAS simply fought their way out and disappeared again. One German patrol, sent to investigate reports of British activity, stumbled upon an abandoned SAS camp. They found tire tracks, empty fuel cans, and a single note pinned to a rock. It read, in English, "Thanks for the supplies. See you soon." The patrol commander was furious, but there was nothing he could do. The SAS were already gone, miles away, planning their next raid. Rommel's frustration grew. He was fighting two wars now, one against the main British forces in Egypt, and another against an enemy he couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't stop. And slowly, inexorably, the Second War was starting to affect the First. By August 1942, Rommel's supply situation was critical. He had enough fuel for one more major offensive. If it failed, he'd have to retreat. And if the SAS kept hitting his convoys, even that fuel might not arrive. He wrote in his diary, "The British have found a way to strike at our weakest point. Not our tanks, not our soldiers, but our supplies. If this continues, we cannot win." He was right. The SAS raids, combined with British air and naval attacks, were slowly strangling the Afrika Korps. And in October 1942, at the Battle of El Alamein, Rommel's forces would be decisively defeated. The tide of the war in North Africa had turned. And while many factors contributed to that victory, the SAS raids played a crucial role. They didn't win the war by themselves, but they made it possible for others to win. By disrupting supply lines, by creating chaos, by making the Germans afraid, they gave the British the edge they needed. And it all started with 2 jeeps, 8 men, and a willingness to do what no one else would: the long road home. After the ambush, Riley and his team had one goal: get back to British lines alive. It sounded simple. It wasn't. They were 150 miles behind enemy lines, low on fuel, low on ammunition, and the Germans were actively searching for them. Every hour they stayed in enemy territory increased the risk of capture or death. But they couldn't just drive straight back. The direct route was too dangerous, too heavily patrolled. Instead, they took the long way. Sadler navigated by stars, leading them on a winding path through the desert, avoiding roads, avoiding settlements, avoiding anything that might give them away. They drove at night, hid during the day, and moved like shadows. On the second night, they ran into a German patrol, 4 motorcycles, moving fast along a dirt track. Riley saw them first, killed the engine, and signaled Sadler to do the same. They sat in silence, watching as the motorcycles passed less than 100 yards away. The Germans didn't see them, didn't even slow down. Just kept going, their headlights cutting through the darkness. When they were gone, Fraser exhaled. "That was close." "Too close," Riley agreed. "We need to move faster." But moving faster meant using more fuel, and fuel was running low. By the 3rd day, they were down to their reserve cans. Sadler calculated they had maybe 50 miles left, not enough to reach British lines. "We need to find more fuel," Sadler said. "Where?" Riley asked. "There's nothing out here." "There's always something. We just have to find it." They drove for another hour, scanning the horizon. Then van der Merwe spotted it. A small German outpost, just a few tents and a supply truck, sitting alone in the middle of nowhere. It was lightly guarded, maybe 6 soldiers, and it had what they needed: fuel. Riley studied the outpost through binoculars. "We could take it. Or we could go around," Sadler suggested. "And run out of fuel 20 miles from safety? No, we take it." They waited until nightfall, then moved in. Silent. Fast. The guards never saw them coming. Riley and van der Merwe took out the sentries with knives, quick and quiet. Fraser and Sadler secured the truck. Inside were fuel cans, water, and food. They loaded everything they could carry, then set charges on the rest. As they drove away, the outpost exploded behind them, a bright orange fireball lighting up the night sky. The Germans would know they were there now. But by the time reinforcements arrived, the SAS would be long gone. They drove through the night, pushing the jeeps to their limits. By dawn, they could see the British lines in the distance: barbed wire, sandbags, the Union Jack flying from a makeshift flagpole. They'd made it. As they crossed into friendly territory, a British sentry waved them down. "Identify yourselves." "SAS," Riley said. "We're coming home." The sentry's eyes widened. "You're the ones who hit that convoy 3 days ago?" "That's us," the sentry grinned. "You're bloody legends, mate. Everyone's talking about it. Come on, I'll take you to HQ." At headquarters, they were debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted to know every detail. The convoy, the ambush, the chase, the escape. Riley told them everything, his voice flat, matter-of-fact. Just another mission. But when he finished, the intelligence officer leaned back in his chair and whistled. "You destroyed 14 vehicles, disabled a Panzer, and escaped from 3 armored cars, with 2 jeeps." "Yes, sir." That's extraordinary." Riley shrugged. "It's what we do." Later, Stirling himself came to see them. He shook each man's hand, looked them in the eye. "You did good work out there, the kind of work that changes wars." "Thank you, sir," Riley said. Stirling smiled. "Get some rest. You've earned it. But not too much rest. We've got another target lined up. Interested?" Riley looked at Fraser, at Sadler, at van der Merwe. They were exhausted, battered, but their eyes were bright. "When do we leave?" 2 days. "We'll be ready." And they were, because that's what the SAS did. They didn't quit. They didn't stop. They just kept going, raid after raid, target after target, until the war was won. The legacy. The SAS raids in North Africa between 1941 and 1943 destroyed over 400 enemy aircraft, countless vehicles, and disrupted supply lines across thousands of miles. They operated with minimal resources, no air support, and often no backup. And they changed the way wars were fought. Before the SAS, special operations were rare, ad hoc, and often unsuccessful. After the SAS, they became a cornerstone of military strategy. Small teams, operating independently, striking at strategic targets. It was a new kind of warfare, and it worked. David Stirling was captured in 1943 and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. But his legacy lived on. The SAS continued to operate, expanding into Europe, conducting raids behind German lines, supporting resistance movements. After the war, the unit was disbanded, then reformed, then became a permanent part of the British military. Today, the SAS is one of the most elite special forces units in the world. They trace their lineage directly back to those early desert raids, to the men in pink jeeps who proved that courage, ingenuity, and audacity could overcome overwhelming odds. Jack Riley survived the war. He returned to Manchester, married, had 3 children, and worked as a mechanic. He rarely talked about his time in the SAS. When asked, he'd just say, "We did what needed to be done." Tommy Fraser also survived. He stayed in the Army, eventually becoming a sergeant himself. He trained new recruits, teaching them the lessons he'd learned in the desert: speed, surprise, never give up. Mike Sadler became one of the most decorated navigators in British military history. He continued to serve with the SAS throughout the war, guiding countless raids across North Africa and Europe. He lived to be 103, passing away in 2023, one of the last surviving members of the original SAS. Piet van der Merwe returned to South Africa after the war. He bought a farm, raised cattle, and lived quietly. But every year, on the anniversary of that convoy raid, he'd raise a glass and toast his old comrades. "To the ghosts in pink jeeps," he'd say, "may they never be forgotten." And they haven't been. Because the story of the SAS desert raids isn't just about tactics or strategy. It's about people. Ordinary people who did extraordinary things, who faced impossible odds and refused to quit, who proved that sometimes the smallest force can have the biggest impact. In the vast, merciless expanse of the North African desert, where temperatures could kill and the enemy seemed invincible, a handful of men in pink jeeps changed the course of history. Not with overwhelming force, but with courage, creativity, and an unshakable belief that they could make a difference. And they did. One raid at a time, one convoy at a time, one night at a time. Until the Desert Fox himself, the legendary Rommel, was forced to admit that he was fighting an enemy he couldn't defeat. Not because they were stronger, but because they refused to fight by the rules. And in war, sometimes the only way to win is to rewrite the rules entirely. That's the legacy of the SAS. That's the legacy of the pink jeeps. And that's why, 80 years later, we still remember their names.